In 1928, Catherine Donahue, a former radium girl, testified in court with a grotesque glow emanating from her jawbone, a result of radiation poisoning that had been eating away at her for years. And this was just the beginning of a horrific tale of corporate greed and female exploitation that would leave hundreds of women dead or dying. But here's where it gets dark. The company she worked for, United States Radium, had knowingly exposed her and hundreds of other female factory workers to deadly radiation. And they did it all for the sake of profit. The year was 1917, and the United States had just entered World War I, creating a huge demand for glow-in-the-dark watches, which were made possible by the use of radium, a highly radioactive substance that was painted onto the watch faces by female factory workers, who were mostly teenagers and young women, eager to work and support their families. These women, who would come to be known as the Radium Girls, were hired to paint the glow-in-the-dark faces of watches and other instruments. And they were told that the radium was harmless, that it was even good for them, and they were encouraged to moisten their brushes with their tongues, thereby ingesting small amounts of radium every day, which would eventually lead to radiation poisoning, a painful and debilitating disease that would destroy their bones, teeth, and overall health. Nobody talks about this part, but the companies that hired these women, including United States Radium and the Waterbury Clock Company, knew about the dangers of radium as early as 1906, when a scientist named Marie Curie had discovered its radioactive properties. And yet they chose to ignore these warnings, and instead, they continued to expose their workers to this deadly substance, all in the name of profit. As the years went by, the Radium Girls began to fall ill, one by one, and they were all experiencing the same horrific symptoms, including anemia, bone cancer, and necrosis of the jaw, a condition that would leave them disfigured and in constant pain. And yet, the companies they worked for refused to take responsibility, and instead, they blamed the women for their own illnesses, saying that they were suffering from syphilis or other diseases. And they even went so far as to claim that the women were poisoning themselves on purpose, in order to collect workers' compensation, which is a ridiculous claim, considering the fact that these women were all young, healthy, and eager to work, before they were exposed to the radium. But here's where it gets even darker. The companies were not only poisoning their workers, but they were also covering up the whole thing, and they were using their wealth and influence to silence the women, and to prevent them from seeking justice. And this is where everything fell apart, because the women, who had once been so full of life and hope, were now fighting for their lives, and they were determined to expose the truth, no matter what it took. In 1927, a group of former Radium Girls, including Catherine Donahue, decided to take matters into their own hands, and they filed a lawsuit against United States Radium, seeking compensation for their illnesses. And they were met with fierce resistance from the company, which claimed that the women were not entitled to workers' compensation, because they had not been employed by the company for at least a year, which was a requirement for receiving benefits. But the women were not deterred, and they continued to fight, even as their health was declining. And they were eventually able to secure a small victory, when the court ruled in their favor, and awarded them a settlement of $10,000 each, which is equivalent to about $150,000 today. But this was just a drop in the bucket, compared to the millions of dollars that the company had made from the sale of glow-in-the-dark watches. And the women knew that they had to keep fighting, if they were going to get the justice they deserved. And this is where the story takes a dramatic turn, because the women's lawsuit had sparked a national outcry, and it had brought attention to the dangers of radiation poisoning, and the need for better workers' safety regulations. And it had also inspired other women to come forward, and to tell their stories. And soon, the whole country was talking about the Radium Girls, and the horrific conditions they had endured, and the companies that had exploited them were being forced to confront the consequences of their actions. The climax of the story came in 1928, when Catherine Donahue testified in court, with her jawbone glowing in the dark, and she told the jury about the horrific conditions she had endured. and the pain and suffering she had experienced. And she demanded justice, not just for herself, but for all of the other radium girls who had been poisoned and exploited by the companies they worked for. And her testimony was so powerful that it brought tears to the eyes of the jury, and it sealed the fate of the companies, which were eventually forced to pay out millions of dollars in compensation to the women, and to implement new safety regulations to prevent this kind of tragedy from happening again. But the damage had already been done, and hundreds of women had already died, or were dying, from radiation poisoning, and their families were left to pick up the pieces, and to wonder how this could have happened, and why the companies had been allowed to get away with it for so long. In the aftermath of the lawsuit, the Radium Girls were finally able to get some measure of justice, and they were able to secure the compensation they deserved. But it was too little, too late, for many of them, and they died soon after, their bodies ravaged by the radiation poisoning, and their lives cut short by the greed and negligence of the companies they worked for. And it's a legacy that continues to haunt us to this day, because it's a reminder of the dangers of corporate greed and the importance of protecting workers' rights. And it's a story that we must never forget, because it's a reminder of the horrors that can occur when companies are allowed to put profits above people. And it's a warning that we must always be vigilant and always fight for justice, no matter what the cost. And this is where the story ends. But it's not the end of the legacy of the Radium Girls, because their story continues to inspire us to fight for what's right, and to never give up in the face of corporate greed and exploitation. So subscribe for more stories like this that will leave you shocked, amazed, and inspired to take action.